I think we are ready to go, right? We are all participants, we're all speakers, so we are good to go. Captions, dear Luis, everything set? We need to fix something else?
All is set.
All is set.
Okay, so whenever you want, we can start if you want.
Maybe you can just stop sharing your screen at the moment.
Okay.
Roberto, it's okay. We can start.
We can start now because I don't think Luis gave us the cue.
Absolutely. Yes, you have green light. Please go ahead.
Okay, please, Karim, you may go then.
Okay. Again, good morning, afternoon, evening to everyone, and welcome to all the people that has joined us in this very important session about inclusion. My name is Karim Atoumani Mohamed. I'm the PMO and Regulatory Project Manager at Telma Comoros, a branch company of Axian Group, and also the Vice President of ISOC Comoro Chapter. In this session, definitive and committed actions for connecting and enabling the remaining billions, together with our panelists, will have a great opportunity to analyze and comment about concrete actions that can be taken from the different perspectives in order to achieve meaningful internet connection for all. Today, we have a fantastic panel, as you can see, with people that you already know very well because of their contributions to shape the internet, representing different sectors and regions all around the world. Let me introduce them. I would like to start with Silvia Cadena, Head of Program at APNIC, the NIC for ASEAN Pacific region, Coordinator for Information Society Innovation Fund, Asia, and fellow MAG member. We also have among us Mrs. Sonia George, Executive Director of Alliance for Affordable Internet. We also have in this panel one of the creators of the very first protocols that were part of the internet from the beginning, and we continue using today. Mr. Vince Cerf, Google Vice President and Internet Evangelist. Next, we have our colleague Christian of Fraherty, Internet Society Regional Vice President for Latin America and the Caribbean regions. Then, coming from Orange, we have its Senior Vice President of Internet and Sustainable Energy Governance, Mr. Mongji Marzouk. And last but not least, Mr. Mokhtar Yedali, Head of Information Society Division for the African Union Commission. They all have remarkable contribution in their respective fields and sectors, and you might know more about them visiting their bio and IGF portal. We thank them for accepting to join us in this session as speakers. I also want to introduce my colleague and fellow MAG member, Roberto Zambrana, from Bolivian IGF, President of Internet Society Bolivia chapter, and ICT Director in La Paz City Hall. Roberto will be co-hosting this session. All participants following this session, please, you are encouraged to write any question in the Q&A section or comments in the chat. I will be reading them in the corresponding action section of this session. So we might start this session now. Roberto, go ahead, please. Take the floor.
Thank you very much, Karim, and thank you very much to our most appreciated panelists for accepting to be part in this session. Well, as you know, during the last, the previous week, from the beginning of this one, in most of those were really great sessions, and first to be part of in a very first virtual IG actually, and we've been listening repeatedly a couple of concepts. One of those, of course, was related to the COVID pandemic that forced us to face a global lockdown. that we had to follow in most of our countries. This situation made all humanity to react, think, and plan in different ways about how to overcome this crisis, trying to continue with our lives. During this IGF, many of the speakers shared their experiences and very fantastic stories about how to bring some normality to our way of living, having internet as the main resource to succeed on this. And for sure, those are great lessons for resilience. Sadly, this wasn't the case for most of humanity. And I say most because despite this encouraging statistics about internet penetration, the reality showed us different situations in which there is still so much to do in order to really achieve meaningful connectivity for everyone. And this was the second concept that was present in many of the previous sessions. But among other things, this is relevant matter that had a main attention from the UN Secretary General, and not only was included as a key theme in analysis of high-level panel on digital cooperation convened by His Excellency Mr. Antonio Guterres, but it's present as the first set of recommendations in the roadmap for digital cooperation that international community must work together in the near future. Well, today in the session, we will discuss about what are the actions that actually made this dream come true and made all the countries and all the people finally to achieve this meaningful connectivity for all. We have some questions, some policy questions that we would like to discuss with the panel. And after that, we will have three rounds of discussions with these policy questions. And after that, we will listen into the people that is attending to this session. Well, beginning with Sylvia, please. And we are going to go through 3 or 4 of our panelists going to one first question, and then we are exchanging idea with the other panelists. Sylvia, what have been the obstacles to achieving affordable and meaningful access to the internet in recent years, despite the significant expansion of mobile infrastructure deploying around the world? What are your thoughts about it? And welcome again to the session, Sylvia.
Gracias, Roberto. Thank you very much. My name is Silvia Cadena. I'm the head of programs of the IPNIC Foundation. And so good morning to everyone. The sun is coming up here in Brisbane, Australia. So my apologies if coffee has not kicked in yet. First of all, I would like to thank Roberto and Karim for the invitation to join this panel. As an outgoing of the MAC, I know it took you many months of preparation, and I'm looking forward to this discussion. The focus of this session is particularly relevant to me as we look into the future in light of the events that you have described. And we have seen a radical acceleration of the digital transformation strategies in many places, but at the same time, the current situation has highlighted disparities between the urban and rural settings worldwide, not only in developing countries, and the challenges to maximize the benefits of internet use, adoption, and coverage. The Asia-Pacific region is geographically vast, culturally and linguistically mega diverse. And the diversity is also reflected across the regulatory frameworks that are in place, the ways businesses are managed, which are not Western-like, and how internet infrastructure is operated. Just here in Brisbane, to give you a personal example, I live less than 10 kilometers away from 4 major hospitals. So I can literally walk to the hospital. But our family doctor was not ready to offer telehealth services during isolation, even though his practice has access to excellent internet connectivity. Other Australians living more than 1,500 kilometers away without leaving our state of Queensland are picked up by the Royal Flying Doctor Service to be able to reach the same hospital that I can walk to, but they have years of experience providing and accessing telehealth services. So the same as my personal experience differs from that of a fellow Australian living just around the corner, meaningful and affordable internet access experiences are different depending on your needs which may be also different depending on where you are. So the question around meaningful access needs, in my personal opinion, to be rooted in a deeper understanding of the local context. To have meaningful access, every individual, every community should find on the internet a way to fill a real need, to solve an existing problem. Internet service providers, mobile operators, and other network operators are looking at innovative, granular approaches to deploy their network and serve their customers. They are open to explore, in the majority of cases, hybrid business models because they have realized that they alone cannot do it all and are looking for collaboration, while many regulators are looking also at lowering the barriers to enter the market for new players, like is the case in Bhutan, while others are exploring community-driven business models, like we call community networks. Christian might mention later. In terms of affordability, I would like to highlight 3 elements that are really important in the context of the Asia Pacific. As the part of the world more prone to be affected by natural disasters, such as bushfires here in Australia earlier this year, earthquakes and cyclones, just to name a few, the cost associated with preparedness and recovery has a very direct impact on affordability. The distances equipment and technicians have to travel and the distribution chains for equipment not manufactured in the region to have it available after a natural disaster requires considerable investments that can literally vanish in the wind. The second one is about compliance with regulatory requirements, especially in light of increasing concerns around online safety and security, which leads me to my third and final point, which is the need to build technical capacity locally to manage threats and minimize harm, to plan, deploy, operate, and maintain the infrastructure. Thank you, Roberto.
Thank you very much, Silvia. Very interesting about this region of the world. And now we can go with Bint, and of course, welcoming him again to the panel. Bint, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Roberto. I certainly want to thank Silvia for being so crisp in her characterization of the problem. I think her perspective applies almost everywhere. Let me give you an example. In the United States, we do not have uniform access to the internet either. We are particularly poorly served in the rural parts of the country, most especially in Native American reservations, but also we find problems even in the core of cities. Some of the problems are physical equipment and availability, but in other cases, it's affordability. And this, I think, is an extremely important component of the utility of the internet. If you can't afford it, you're not going to be able to use it. I love very much Silvia's point about internet being an enabling experience. So if we think a little bit more broadly about what it means to be inclusive with regard to internet access and use, not only do we have to worry about physical facilities and their ability to be operated sustainably and affordably, but we have to worry about whether the internet is useful. And that, of course, implies whether or not it has content which is locally useful, whether or not it provides services that are needed. A very good example of that arising out of the pandemic and related to Silvia's points, remote medicine has turned out to be very important all of a sudden. Here in the US, even if I could walk to my hospital, which I sort of could if I were really well, I don't know, if I were really sick and couldn't make it to the hospital, it's several miles away. I don't know if I could walk or not. The problem here is that they don't want you here. The doctor says, please don't come into the office. I'm worried about COVID-19. We don't have adequate protective equipment. Please call me or have a video call. And of course, my reaction to this is, what kind of medicine is that? You didn't take my temperature, my blood pressure, my weight and height, and all the other physical things that make me feel like you're paying attention to the state of my body. And so I think the implications of this in the internet context are that more and more devices are going to be both needed and invented in order to capture our state of health so that remote medicine is possible. And that's going to be true whether you're in the middle of the city or whether you're off in some very distant and rural location. So I think we can anticipate over the course of the next several years that remote medicine will become more relevant than it ever has been before to more people. Last point is new technologies, and we're starting to see the emergence not only of an increasing amount of mobile capability, but also increasing speeds, as we have heard and seen from 4G, now 5G, and there's even rumors of 6G. There are the low Earth orbiting satellite assets that are going up, including those from SpaceX, for example, which are now in beta test. And just recently, several of my colleagues and I participated in a test of a solar-powered aircraft, which is flying at 65,000 feet and just loitering over an area providing LTE service in analog to another Alphabet company, the holding company of Google, Loon, which has balloons at 65,000 feet that are circulating in a given part of the, what am I looking for, latitude, circulating in a given latitude and being managed by headwinds and tailwinds by going up and down in altitude. Those are also delivering 4G kinds of services to the ground. And so you don't need any special equipment other than a mobile in order to take advantage of that kind of service. We also are starting to see the use of free space lasers in order to extend, for example, an underlying either undersea or surface fiber capacity. If it doesn't make sense to put fiber on poles because of the expense or to trench, then sometimes straight laser shots will help you extend access to the internet. So my sense right now is that we have a lot of angles that we need to attend to in order to make the internet useful. Most importantly now, content, which is enabling so people can solve the kinds of problems that Sylvia alluded to. So I'll stop there, but thank you so much for allowing this intervention.
Thank you very much, Bent. And indeed, you mentioned one important factor about all the emerging technologies that are related in mobile, like 5G or even 6G, as you said. But perhaps most of the population right now will be grateful having 4G all deployed around the world. And that led us to, and I want to also welcome again to Monji, and to share with us what of his view, coming from a very important mobile company in the world, what were the actions, what can we say about this first topic that we are discussing with? Monji, please, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good afternoon and good morning for everybody, for all attendees. I'm very happy to be with you today, and also happy to discuss with you a very important topic regarding digital inclusion. All of us know the importance. In fact, in my first introduction, I will highlight the importance of digital inclusion. What are the main gaps? It is not coverage, as you know, but digital skills, affordability of access and handsets, and the local content and usage. And in the end of this first introduction, I will speak about many programs launched by governments, international and national and local institutions, operators, tech companies, in order to contribute to improve digital inclusion. As you know, the digital technology are pivotal to achieve sustainable development and global inclusion. And during COVID-19 pandemic, it's frequently stated that the world's reliance on the internet has never been greater, and connectivity has never been more important to secure basic needs, to continue social relationships, and to maintain many economic activities. As confirmed by many statistics and studies, the internet access is far from being a coverage issue. Global, approximately, we have 3.4 billion people who live in area covered by a mobile broadband network, 3G and more, and don't use mobile internet. However, we have around 600 million people live in area without network coverage. So compare 600 million to 3.4 billion. The fact that coverage is not the top barrier is confirmed also by many figures reported by ITU last year, by the end of last year, in the document Measurement Digital Developments, when we see that almost the entire world population, 97%, lives within reach of mobile coverage, and 93% of the world population lives within reach of a mobile broadband, 3G and more. However, only 53% are actually using internet. And we have some important gap between developed countries where about close to 87% are using internet. However, in least developed countries, only 90% of individuals are online. What are the top reasons? Stéphane Richard, the chairman of the CEO of Orange, Stéphane Richard, the CEO of Orange and chairman of GSMA. GSMA is the Association of Mobile Network Operators, presented 3 reasons for why most Africans are not on the internet and how to connect them. The first one is affordability. The cost of handsets, energy, power in many African countries, and the cost of data are still too high. Also, the UN Broadband Commission for Sustainable Development sets in 2018 as a target for 2055 that entry-level broadband service should be less than 2% of monthly gross national income. In November 2019, the Commission reported that in 61 countries, a fixed broadband subscription includes 5 gigabytes of data costs less than 2%. And 89 countries, including 4 low developed countries, a mobile broadband subscription with 1.5 gigabyte data package costs also less than. But also considerable progress has been made in recent years. Affordable remain a challenge in many countries, especially in low developed countries. And the first barrier is affordability. The second is lack of digital skills and literacy. This one is the top barrier to mobile internet use in low and middle income countries, as well as key issue in developing countries. And the third, presented by Stéphane Richard, the lack of content in local language represents a major issue outside of US, Europe, and China. Contents and service must be relevant to citizens and meet their needs. As you know, also since 2015, IGF community has identified 5 main dimensions and policy options for increasing connectivity, deploying infrastructure, increasing usability and local content, enable users, inclusiveness, user literacy, digital citizenship, ensuring affordability, and creating an enabling environment. So government, international and local institutions organized and relevant companies are aware of the multidimensional aspects of internet access, and many of them are working to address those gaps. For example, GSMA, the Worldwide Association of Mobile Network Operators, has launched Connected Society program and a platform, GSMA Thrive Africa platform, to work with the mobile industry, technology companies, the development community, and governments to increase access and to address and adoption of mobile internet, focusing on underserved population groups in developing markets. Its program key activity include cooperating and disseminating insights and learnings on the mobile internet coverage and usage, supporting mobile operators to extend coverage and drive usage, undertaking advocacy and policy work to ensure that mobile operators' effort to achieve greater digital inclusion are being effectively supported by government, the international community, and other stakeholders. And thank you.
Thank you, Monji. There is a very nice and vibrant conversation among the chat. I encourage you all, the participants, to exchange ideas. There are some actually regarding one of the statistics that Monji were mentioning before, and that leads us to where first again, welcome Sonia. And we all know that in your institution, you produce a lot of information and statistics about this affordability issue, and we would love to know about your thoughts regarding this first subject.
Thank you, Roberto, and thank you, everyone, especially the IGF organizers, the MEG, for the invitation and for the opportunity to be here with you today. First of all, this discussion has already been very interesting, just listening to all of you, and especially listening to and reading the comments from the chat. I think what many of you have made clear, starting with Sylvia, from what it means to really be meaningfully connected, but also what it means to have affordable and meaningful access. It's absolutely core and center stage for us at the Alliance for Affordable Internet, as you know. And this is precisely why we actually developed the concept with many of you and our partners of what we believe internet access should look like, and how should we measure internet access around the world from this perspective of affordable and meaningful access. So I wanted to cover two items in response to this first question that you posed, Roberto. One is in response to what others are already asking. For us, affordable and meaningful access means that everyone has access to the internet every day with enough data, with a fast connection, and with an appropriate device. And if you don't have that, what you have is never going to be meaningful connectivity, because you will not be able to have or to benefit from the kinds of opportunities, services, and needs that Sylvia, Vint, and others have already mentioned on the chat. And what do we mean by that precisely? When we're talking about the right speed, we're talking about, at a minimum, a 4G equivalent type of connection with sufficient data, ideally unlimited data, an appropriate device that needs to start at the level of the functionality of a smartphone. And anything less than that, unless it provides the functionality, is not something that we should accept. And most importantly, people should be able to have access to information, to services, be innovative, creative, entertain themselves and their family every day, however they decide. And so unless we collectively are not thinking about affordable and meaningful connectivity from that perspective that brings all of those critical elements together, we are shortchanging the world and very much contributing to further inequality and exclusion in the world, instead of making sure that the investment that is required, the policy and regulatory frameworks that we need to think of and support are such that support an environment where affordable and meaningful connectivity is a reality. And so with that in mind, I want to actually challenge some of the assertions that were made. And I apologize, Mongi, but as you know, operators are wonderful partners, but often they have a very different understanding of what we need in our sector for true digital development to be a reality. And I'll start by mentioning something that actually someone on the chat mentioned, which is about coverage. And you too, Roberto. To me, it starts with that. When someone tells me that 85% of the world is covered by mobile networks, I start cringing and getting very, very uncomfortable, because the reality is that that is not true. A large percentage of the population of the world is covered by networks that are unreliable, lack the quality, and do not provide affordable and meaningful connectivity of the kind that many of my colleague panelists have already outlined. And so that kind of coverage has been a really wonderful progress, and it's been a good contribution to a sector that, you know, now we know it's more urgent and more important than ever in the concept, in our wider ecosystem of development. We cannot think of digital access and meaningful connectivity as an add-on, as a luxury, as something that people may have if it's possible. It is a necessity. It is a public good. It is a basic right. And anything less than that is not acceptable for the world. And so what I would say is that I want to hear the numbers of coverage when that coverage is about everyone being covered by 4G connections everywhere, not just in urban areas, not just in groups of the population that are high revenue generating customers, but everyone. No one should be shortchanged by different policies. We should not discriminate. We should not contribute to further exclusion and inequality. And so we all collectively have a responsibility to change mindsets, not just in terms of investment, in terms of our objectives for digital development, and most importantly, to make sure that our policy and regulatory frameworks everywhere in the world, at the global level, at the regional level, and at the national level, respond to these needs, respond to this reality, and in fact support not only growth that we want to see in the sector, including with really smart investments by the private sector, but also very smart investments from the public sector in partnership with multilateral development organizations, by governments, and most importantly, here we are at IGF. You need to listen to what civil society wants from digital development. If we don't hear what people want, if we don't have a clear understanding of how people want to engage with technology, then we are not serving people and we are not serving the public. So our role is to change the mindset, to focus on the public interest, and to make sure that any decisions that we make have that as core and center to any and all of their actions. And I look forward to more of the discussion and to hear more, especially from the participants. The chat and the comments keep growing, and I wish I could be there with you at the same time. But here we are, and a lot more to say.
Thank you very much, Sonia. Indeed, the chat is growing and growing. Thank you very much, because this was a very nice closure for this first round. And now we can move to the second policy questions, which says, what principles, approaches, incentives, and coordinated actions as enabling environment should be central to telecommunications regulatory frameworks in order to spur investment in a drive better affordability of internet, inclusive access, and connectivity solutions in developing countries, particularly in order to accelerate its penetration in the region. And welcoming Mokhtar, we can start with you this round. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And but before, thank you very much for having me first. But before going to this second round, I would like to take you back a little bit on what does it mean inclusiveness and meaningful access that most of the people do. And to illustrate what I'm going to say, I'm going to give you just an example. I am here in Addis Ababa. I'm assuming in actually the capital of Africa, and I have almost 1 gigabit coming to my house on a fiber optics. But my problem is when the power is cut, I lose everything. So I find myself with a very good car, which is actually BMW without benzene or without knowing how to use it. So this is where one of the biggest mistakes sometimes people do in apprehending the issue of access to internet is to forget the issue of power. And if you look at this very much, if you look at it, this thing very much, you will see that there is a very good correlation, specific in Africa, a correlation function between the rate of access to electricity or clean cooking and the rate of access to internet. You see that they are close, 40%. If you look also at the discrimination between the urban and rural areas, you see that 40% of the people are actually in the urban areas, and that's the 40% that are getting access to internet. So remember, when we were engineering, doing engineering and setting up the network, what we do, the first thing is to ask the question, how will I power my station? How will I power my station, be it my station in the sky or be it in the earth? The first question I ask, if I am not able to power that station, then it is useless. And this is what's happening most of the time. And when Munji said that there is a 95% coverage, yes, probably there is on 2G, 1G, if any 1G has existed. But the issue is, even those people who do have the good signal of 4G cannot afford to access, because simply there is no power in their houses, and there is no devices that they can be used to access meaningfully to specific application and so on. So this is the fundamental question that we need to access. And we as people from ICT, we think that is not our responsibility. We assume that the public sector or the energy sector have done his job by providing the power, and we have just to plug in. That's not true. We need at this point of time to coordinate and see that we cannot apprehend the issue of access to internet without taking into factor other things. Because if we think about literacy, why don't we think about also energy sector, for instance? Why don't we think that probably the rate of urbanization, how to stop that? Why don't you think that there is a better way to invest and to keep the population somewhere else? 2 years or 3 years ago, I have calculated the number of bandwidth that exists in Africa, and I've said a tremendous amount of bandwidth. And guess what? The utilization rate of the current existing bandwidth of Africa is below 35%. We have a tremendous amount of megahertz floating everywhere, but that is just noisy. There is the electricity sector have, the transport sector do have capacity, they do have fiber, everybody has fiber somewhere else, but it's not being used at all. So this is where we have to shape our policy in taking into consideration the fact that we need to apprehend the development or the meaningful access to internet in a 360-degree vision, rather than just focusing on what is related to us. With that, I stop here, and I will be glad to answer to your questions. I second what had been said. I wouldn't like to repeat it again, but there was a good suggestion from everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mokhtar. And actually, African region is very similar, belonging to the global south to Latin America. And from there, we have Christian Flaherty, and we welcome him in this panel. And of course, we will love to hear your thoughts. Christian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Roberto, and I'm grateful, proud of being part of this panel with such distinguished colleagues. And so I met some of you, like Bint and Sylvia, more than 20 years ago in the 90s, when at that time we were building the networks, we were deploying the equipments, learning, and some people like Bint and others were teaching us how to do that. So at that time, we had to make a huge effort to reach the internet, to build, and in our countries, in Latin America, Sylvia was in Colombia at that time, there were no routers in our countries, there was no appropriate infrastructure, so everything was built from scratch to build something that nobody knew about at that time. So we had to convince our bosses, to convince everyone that it was worth investing on something that they didn't know. Unfortunately, a few years later, the situation changed completely, and that there were a lot of businesses around the internet and a lot of internet service providers that saw the business case and started to deploy their own networks, and we got used to wait for the internet to reach to us, to connect our houses, to connect our universities. So in a few years, the new normal was for the internet to reach those places willing to connect. We all recognized that it was something that was for good, for not only for entertainment, but a lot of value. So not only the business around the internet was clear, but also the need, and the governments regulated accordingly. So the whole system was ready and in place to develop the internet based on the business models for internet service providers. And it was very, very successful. And with that system, we were able to connect almost half of the world. But now we are in a situation that is similar to what happened in the early stages, where the current business model, it's more encouraging the service providers to improve the access whenever people is connected with more speed, newer technologies, and not that much in reaching those areas where people is not yet connected. So we have to go back to the style that we had at the beginning and try to enable those unconnected places to build their networks, small businesses, communities, whatever, so they're able to reach a connected place, they're able to deploy their own affordable access and connecting to a connected place, to the internet. So in order for that to happen, we need to adapt. We need several changes. We have to create an enable environment, as it's proposed in the question. The question is about regulatory changes and enable environment for those places that need to improve their access. So we have to adapt, we have to change, we have to try new things in those areas that are not yet connected, not only rural areas, but also within cities, as Dean and Sylvia mentioned. There are places nearby where there's a need for appropriate access. Sometimes it's affordability, sometimes it's infrastructure, sometimes it's power. So there are many reasons. So we have to create this environment. And in order to do that, we need to change several things. We need to be open to new approaches and changes and doing things differently. And that's sometimes difficult to get or to convince in regulators and businesses and those that are that got used to work the way they did so far. So we have to be prepared to adapt, because sometimes when you do changes, you have to correct them. So eventually you have to correct things that you decided, because some of the changes and the things that you've tried may not work as you think, but you have to be open for those new approaches. You have to involve as many people as possible in the decision. So when governments deploy new projects for deploying infrastructure, or new rules, or new regulations to access spectrum, so whatever it is decided that is aiming to connect people, you need to involve as many parties as possible in the discussion. Because if you want things to change, you need to address and to analyze all the possibilities. Also, we have to be fearless, and nowadays it's not that difficult, because there's unanimous support on connecting those that are unconnected. So we are all aligned on this. This year, as Dean and others mentioned, several things are more obvious than they were in the past. Nowadays, nobody doubts about the value of the internet, that internet is a force for good. So if we are all aligned, it's easy to convince people that we may try things that might look risky, or that may have some pushback from others. So let's try to benefit from that, and let's try to identify and remove barriers for ways to deploy new infrastructure. So Oftentimes, as I mentioned before, all the system is prepared for businesses, and oftentimes those are at the same time barriers for new small companies or community networks, or those trying to build small parts of the network to reach a connected place. Authorizations, rights, permissions, everything is prepared for usually big companies. Also, the processes, the signatures, there are business agents that need to be involved to go to the capital cities. Everything is problematic when you think about a rural area or a distant place. So let's try to identify those barriers, involve those that are the ones that we want to help, see what do they need and how can we support them. So that would be my proposal. And on the second question, we can think about commitments.
Thank you very much, Christian. And of course, you were started in this more action-oriented comments, and you also mentioned the difficulties that we have to overcome and include in the analysis. And it's similar to what Sylvia said. And now we may go with Sylvia about what actions can be taken in order to overcome what you mentioned in your first intervention. You have the floor, Sylvia.
Thanks, Roberto. Going back to the points that I made on my, sorry, there is a window from the Secretariat that is blocking my view. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Going back to the points that I made on my initial intervention, but I'm not now going to go in a reverse order. I would like to highlight first the importance of increasing the level of investment in building technical capacity locally. The internet is as fast, as secure, as reliable, and affordable as the capacity of the engineers that deploy it, operate it, and maintain it. They may be invisible. We may be invisible when your connectivity doesn't work as you expected, but they are certainly the fairy dust that make it look like magic. So I think that resonates with the comment that Christian made about how we met over 20 years ago when Bint was our teacher, and we were trying to figure out how to bring the internet to our countries in Latin America. And now that I'm living in Asia, in 20-something years later, many of those challenges remain. If you just give me a second, I'm having a glitch here with my notes. Just give me a minute. I need to reload this. Sorry.
If I may, in the meantime, we are, of course, receiving your questions. You may use, if you want, the question and answer button that we have. I know that there's a lot of chats going on, and but some of you are also using this section. So again, you're encouraged to put your questions using this button, questions and answers, Q&A. And Karim, of course, is also registering and systematizing them in order for our panelists to react later.
I'm ready. Sorry, Roberto. The second point that I wanted to make was about, also resonates with what Christian mentioned, is that it's so important to have key and honest and open conversations between regulators, the government agencies and operators about the operational and financial impact of compliance with regulatory requirements that may be negatively affecting affordability targets when exploring deployment of new technologies, like being mentioned in the first segment, when facilitating access to remote communities, for example. Dialogue can help the regulators to gain a deeper understanding and appreciation of the challenges that new players in the market may experience to be able to be sustainable, like what Christian just mentioned, as well as support change of the larger operators where compliance affects a large portion of their business, something that resonates with what Monji was mentioning before. I think there is a big misunderstanding between what actually happens in between, in those closed doors, and the challenges that those operators actually face, the large and the small. And that dialogue needs to happen in an open way, which sometimes it's difficult, because when you put all the cards on the table, you're actually giving away part of your competitive advantage. So that is why having network operators groups, NOGs, as we call them in the technical community, is so important to make those bridges between network operators to discuss technical and business topics that affects them, and compliance with regulatory requirements is one of those. Finally, I think it is extremely important to continue to support effective coordination around disaster management and raise the current investment around disaster preparedness so that recovery is faster. And in that regard, just as an example of what happened when Cyclone Pam hit Vanuatu, for example, trying to understand what some of the smaller providers, back then we were engaging with one called Telsat, that they had to have all the 17 towers that they used to connect the different islands, all stored under the ground, ready to go, in case the other towers were knocked down. So if you have to do that and bring a tower in a ship from New Zealand already put together over the ocean in a boat, it makes a whole different, it takes a lot of effort to actually make it happen. So in that cost of rebuilding the infrastructure one and again, every summer when a cyclone hits, is seriously affect affordability in economies where the population is very small, to actually be able to make the margins that investment requires. One example, to go back to what Mokhtar mentioned on electricity, I think you read my mind probably, is that one of the examples of coordinated action, which is the point of this second action around regulatory frameworks that could benefit the community, is a deeper exploration across the global south of the connection between the internet connectivity provision and electricity provision, which is, as you mentioned, Mokhtar, intrinsically linked across the developing world, as well as in many isolated areas of developed countries. There are technical innovations already in place that support the provision of internet access in combination with green electricity provision that could support the development of sustainable business models targeting real community needs. That in those models, the electricity provision is what actually supports the sustainability of the internet access. That literally hits two birds with one stone. But because the regulatory frameworks for those two services are most commonly managed by independent agencies, then those working on scaling up those technologies face considerable hurdles to be able to make it sustainable and available at a mass scale. You can check, I will post later on the chat, there is this really interesting and neat innovation in our region called SoulShare that is also supported by Microsoft grants, that is linking those, the technology for internet provision and the technology for electricity provision. But the regulatory framework doesn't allow them to make that model sustainable. And there are many others working in similar solutions. Thank you, Roberto. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Silvia. And for closing this second round, we're going with Bint now. And we all know that he had the opportunity to deal with several regulatory themes, but I think he's also going to repeat several of his comments that he's provided in the chat for those that are following the other channels and not allow for them to see the messages, and they're really rich. You have the floor, Bint.
Oh, thank you very much again, Roberto. I have to say about the chat, I've seen some very interesting things happen between a serial presentation, which is what our oral part is about, and the fact that people can be simultaneously saying things without colliding with each other because the system, spreads them out and puts them in some sequence. I've watched some of these discussions suddenly fall silent, where everyone goes over here to the chat because they don't have to wait for their turn to type something. That, of course, raises the other question that someone raised in the chat, which is how the heck do you follow all this? Because it's not in any particular order. It's like a giant cocktail party. Well, look, let me come back to the points that have been made already. The first one is that there are a wide range of different requirements that need to be satisfied in order to make the internet a useful facility. And it goes all the way from the provision of electricity to physical facilities for radio and wiring and optical fiber, and then into the application space, the languages in which the information is available and discoverable, literacy in the use of the system, and also knowledge about how to use the internet safely. And that topic hasn't come up yet, but we all understand that this environment is not necessarily the safest in the whole world. The equipment that you get that has software in it may or may not be able to defend itself against a serious denial of service attack or against malware, which is exploiting bugs in the software. And so this is actually a very serious problem. And most people, including probably a good many of us, and me included, are not in a position to actually go and secure their own equipment. We don't have access to the source code. Not everyone is a programmer. There are many different programming languages used in order to implement the technologies that we're relying on. And so there is a safety and security and literacy component to all of this that we should keep in the back of our minds as well. And then I think the final point that I'd like to make is, as I listen to the aspirations and the expression of problems that need to be solved, is that even if we manage to solve all those problems, we will have created what I consider to be a potentially fragile infrastructure that we're depending on. And I'm nervous about our increasing dependency on these complex systems. Especially software. I used to make a living writing software, and I have a little dent in my forehead from the many times when I had to go, oh, what a stupid mistake I made. And probably a lot of programmers have this little programmer's dent. So we are very dependent. We as a population are very dependent on the skill of software programmers. And to make matters worse, not only are we dependent on their skills, but we're dependent on them to find and fix bugs. And then how do the bug fixes actually get to where they need to go? How do we know where they came from? How do we know they haven't been altered on their route from the source to the destination computer or destination device that needs the updated software? All of those considerations need to be part of the solution if we are going to insist on using these very powerful tools, but also very complex tools in order to carry on our daily lives. The pandemic has simply highlighted how dependent we are, and increasingly so, because of the absence of our ability to be in proximity to each other. It also has highlighted what I consider to be the inequities in response, because some people cannot work without being in proximity. And if they can't be in proximity, they can't work, and that has a big economic impact. So we have just a huge range of issues to be addressed, as the panel has outlined. Now, on the good side, we have people on the panel and in this session and more generally at IGF who actually care about solving those problems and are looking for the technical and the policy and the economic solutions that are needed. And so that gives me some hope that discussions like this one will lead to real solutions to making the internet affordable, sustainable, and useful for the bulk of the world's population.
Thank you very much, Bint. Again, another great closure for the round. And we're going now to the third round with the question, are there particular telecommunications business models in fixed and mobile broadband internet services that have been shown to be particularly effective at expanding affordable access to the internet? And what are the role of the other stakeholders in bringing about this increased investment and affordable access. We can start with Sonia, please.
Thank you,
You have the
Roberto.
floor.
Again, so interesting to hear everyone. I'll start by actually picking up on something that Vint mentioned about fixing bugs. I think one of the things that we have to do, especially to welcome new business models, new innovation, not just in financing, but especially in supporting complementary providers and really new ways of thinking about the business of providing access, is by fixing a couple of bugs in policy and regulatory frameworks that in fact prevent all of these complementary providers from not being bugs, but actually being welcome members of the ecosystem. And so I would say that those kinds of business models, and I'm sure Christian might come back to that again, are the kinds that support and that many different community networks are implementing. In fact, I'm sure there's others on this session that have done some work in that area. And I think community networks have a really wonderful promise and provide an incredible promise and hope into how we can reach many communities that have not been reached, that remain unconnected, that not only remain unconnected, but are not covered, are very far from ever being able to afford. And so it's also important to think about not just community networks and rural operators, cooperatives, all sorts of different kinds of complementary providers that can fill the gaps that currently exist in the sector, gaps that have remained because of this traditional way of thinking about policy and regulation that primarily benefits large operators, the MNOs, which again are very important, but are not able on their own to not only connect everyone, but to provide access to everyone affordably and meaningfully. So I would say fixing some of the bugs in the policy and regulatory frameworks is absolutely critical. And one important bug in that, there's many that we can talk about. In fact, we do a lot of work in that area, and I urge you to look at some of the work that we've done. But a couple of that I like to highlight. One is precisely related to the point that Mokhtar mentioned on power, is having a lot more collaboration between the power and telecom sectors and making sure that infrastructure is better planned, better coordinated, so that there's a greater amount of infrastructure sharing, but most importantly, more coordination around infrastructure planning, so that we can reduce the overall costs of the industry, especially on the infrastructure side, and therefore transfer those savings from really good infrastructure planning, including with the power sector, to lower costs to the users. It's not about just saving and reducing the cost of the industry, but making sure that those savings are transferred to users and customers of the entire ecosystem. But the other area, in addition to infrastructure sharing issues, that is really important, and especially important for complementary providers, is new innovative ways of thinking about spectrum policy, where unlicensed spectrum should be by default a norm and not an exception. It shouldn't be that anyone in any country or region of the world should be begging regulators to have a slim of a band to provide either Wi-Fi, public access, or any other kind of community-based access. That should be the default. In fact, all regulators and policymakers should include in their policies provisions to ensure that percentages of the public good that spectrum is allocated to the public interest, to make sure that people have access to connectivity in that way. And I think you mentioned, Vint, earlier, the whole issue around Wi-Fi. That's exactly where it's come from. We're very fortunate to benefit from Wi-Fi opportunities in many parts of the world, and in others, there's very little. And because of these. So again, a lot of these bugs can be fixed. It's very easy to fix them. We need the will, the political will, and the commitment from those involved to actually make it happen. And the last point in terms of investments and stakeholders, Roberto, that you asked, as many of you might know, we did work with ITU recently, which under Doreen Bogdan has made tremendous progress in how to think differently about digital development. And we're very proud and pleased to work with the ITU team to develop what's called the Connecting Humanity report, Connecting Humanity by 2030 to universal access. This idea of universal access that is at a minimum 4G connectivity. And one of the things that we explored in that analysis and that report is precisely the important collaboration and really cooperation amongst all of the stakeholders in the ecosystem to bring about really good partnerships, really good investments, so that we can achieve that estimate that we put out of $428 billion of investment that is required in the next decade, simply to bring the world to that level of connectivity that we've been discussing here today. And so stakeholders all have a role to play. And they have a role to play not just as investors, but they have a role to play to make sure that as we invest in the sector, we don't forget the importance of investing in digital skills, in content, in updating and revising policy and regulatory frameworks in the way that we were just discussing. But most importantly, really embracing this challenge and believing that it's possible. It is actually possible, without sounding too naive and perhaps a bit provocative. I want to say something that I shared with the colleagues as we were preparing for this session today. 428 billion may sound like a lot to a lot of people. It's not very much at all. That's 42 billion a year over the next decade, okay? I'll tell you what, the world spends about that 428 billion on soda on an annual basis. Soda. Something unnecessary, no one needs. That's what we spend annually in the world on soda. If we think that meaningful, affordable connectivity is more important than soda, I think we can collectively master our skills, our collective mind and feist to bring about 428 billion to bring people online. And that's my call to all of you, is to partner with us, with our partners, with the entire ecosystem to make that happen. We know what needs to be done. We just need to make sure that those that have the resources do it right and do it in the public interest and not in the interest of the few and of the elites. And that's not good enough, as I said before. So thank you again, Roberto. Really wonderful to see the discussion, and I hope we can share more.
Thank you very much, Sonia. It was a great beginning for this final round. And we move to Monji now and want to receive your thoughts. You have the floor, Monji.
Thank you. First, I have to comment some in the first speech of Sonia. In fact, when I reported some figures on coverage and mobile network coverage, those figures reported by ITU, and those information all provided by governments. And I have to say also, I'm ICT minister for more than 10 years in Tunisia. I agree with you on reliability of the coverage. But what I want to say that the coverage gap is an issue, but more important than that is affordability. Skills, digital skills is very important. But why? Because we have more than 3 billion people lives in coverage, maybe good, not good, but 3G and higher coverage, but they don't use internet. However, we have around maybe more, maybe 1 billion, 1.5, but less than 3 billion. So we can say 1 billion without coverage. And here we remark this figure is close to the number of people living without power, without electricity, mainly in sub-Saharan. So as you said, I agree with you. As you said, there are some link, a very important link between power, electricity, grid coverage, and telecommunication coverage. I agree with you that network coverage still an issue. And when we say, when we cover, for example, for rural, it's outside coverage, it's not indoor, and it's not deep indoor. You know, I were also for many years engineer for telecommunication. So, so it's not, it's only outside. This is why it's not reliable. This is why the link is weak. This is why we need to innovate. We need to share spectrum. We need to better policy of spectrum. We need to provide low band frequency with better coverage. This point, I agree with you. We have to address network coverage to improve the signal quality, to improve the throughput, to improve coverage. But you know, the indoor coverage in rural indoor coverage is not an easy issue, but we have to work on that. The second, we have to address the issue, and it's very important, of skills. You know, data protection, even now for engineer to manage how to protect our data is not so easy. Each time you open a website, you have many questions. It's not so easy. So we have to work, to train, to coach in order to improve digital skills in those countries. Also, we have to as operator and also as government, to push for inclusive offers. You know, when we speak about universal service is not only coverage, it's coverage also and social offer for population. And this now, this second element is very, very important. So we have to work on inclusive offers, and we have to work with government, with tech company, with suppliers on the price of smartphones, the cost of handsets. So coverage, digital skills, and local contents, how to have a service from administration, how to, and so these four acts, or these four items, we have to focus on them together. But what I said, coverage, yes, still an issue, but we have another affordability, we have skills issue to address, and they become very important in inclusion issue. And thank you.
Thank you, Monji. We go with Mokhtar now, please. And perhaps you can tell us about any particular experience that you remember in the Africa, in all the Africa, about one particular example that you may share with us regarding this nice actions that some operators could provide in order to get affordable services for their citizens. You have the floor, Mokhtar.
Thank you very much. To be honest with you, there is no really a substantial example I will have to, I know of, to provide to you with regard to a good example in providing affordable access within the continent. Specifically, it's due to the fact that, unfortunately, in Africa, the majority of the operators are actually non-African operators, and most of them, most of the time, have been guided by the return of the investment rather than looking at the ICTs as means of developing the continent. And it's fair. It's fair. It's just it's very fair. But allow me to comment first before going there to comment on what has been said. First of all, Sonia has said whatever I wanted to say with regard to that. So thank you, Sonia, for saving me time. But I want just to comment on a small thing that there is no, what has started as a bug in the policy and the regulation with the continent has been compiled until it's become a tragedy. In fact, it's not anymore, I don't talk anymore about the bug in the regulation of the continent. Most of the African countries has get into the trap of recycling the same regulatory environment and policy and keeping that going. And you know, when the bug starts somewhere, you could adding it to things, and then you get into the strategy. Most of the regulatory framework that has been how can I say, proposed to Africa, for instance, did not take into consideration the example in the United States, the Eagle Mountains. That was a very good example of affording, access. The FCC programs that are actually allowing the broadband access, the Obama programs in affording, broadband to everybody, that has not been taken into consideration by those development institutions that are coming to Africa by trying to say that, we are bringing to you something that is good. We impose on you the privatization of your sector. We provide you with a model of licensing that probably not adequate to African continent because we didn't take into consideration the realities. The fact that Africa has been provided with a model of licensing and model of managing their ICT sector coming from outside without taking into consideration what is actually the realities of the country itself. Vast density, low literacy, all of that has not been taken into consideration. At the beginning, we created what we call the universal access agencies, and from there, those agencies become, a way of, getting funding, what we call an election or so on. So, unfortunately, there is those operators, One Africa, for instance, as tremendously resisting, for instance, the issue of community network. The community network, for instance, could have been something that could solve the problems. But those non-African operators are tackling that at the ITU meetings. They are tackling it everywhere else because they say, oh, this is our space. But in the same time, they're not doing that. So to respond to your question, there is a need specifically for Africans and developing countries to adapt, to fix the bugs by allowing non-classical operators to get into areas where they cannot, where there is no connectivity. And as Sonia said, it has to be well coordinated. It's not only providing access to ICT, but also providing roads, energy. It's whole urban plannings and infrastructure planning should be seen together. And once you see that together, you will see that there is no need for corporate social responsibility or anything else. Everything will fall down and everything will be fit very well. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mortar. And finally, we are closing this round with Christian. You have the floor.
Thank you, Roberto. So before going to the questions on business models, I would like to support what Mortar has just said, and also would like to provide a couple of examples about what Mongi and Sonia mentioned about the spectrum and the need to adapt our rules, laws, regulations to access to spectrum. We've been working with community networks. I'm going to address that in a few minutes, but in places where there's no business case for companies to deploy networks, and we managed to get sustainable networks in places where the spectrum was completely clean. Nobody was using what they were allocated, and nobody was able to use it because it had an owner. And nowadays, as been mentioned before, there are many new technologies, and there were improvements on technologies like the mobile technologies like 4G, which nowadays do have open source software for the network and very inexpensive base stations. So it's not difficult for a local small company or community or cooperative to deploy their own network, even when it's not a viable business for a company. So they could do it themselves if they were allowed to, but they can't because somebody owns the spectrum that nobody's using. So we, as Mortar said, we have to change some of the things that have been working so far, and now we realize that they need some changes. And the question itself, it's about business models. So it's clear that the current business model is very, very effective, and companies were very successful on developing the internet so far. But there are cases that need an adaptation, that need a different approach. So one of the things that worked very well, as I mentioned before, it's where the communities themselves are responsible on building their own service, their own network, and reaching a connected place. And it's obvious that it's not a competing solution, it's a complementary solution, because they have to reach an operator. They have to build their network to reach a connected place. So operators shouldn't consider that a competing solution, because for them, it's demonstrated that it wasn't worth investing in those places. And when you let the local community, the local small businesses or NGOs or whatever that it's organized, and let them build their own network, they will create a service that is affordable for them. And as I said, there are many options nowadays to deploy an expensive internet access networks. So we have to empower those communities to let them create the service that they need, and identify and remove all the barriers that nowadays are preventing those networks to arise. And for them to be sustainable and effective, there's a big component on the community part. So we have to have a well-organized group of people that are aligned and willing to solve their problem. Then you have to train it. As Vincent before, nowadays technologies are complex. There are a lot of security risks when you deploy the networks, because there are a lot of software components, and we can't apply the standard business model where there's a vendor that deploys the network for you, turnkey projects where somebody comes and installs the equipment, configures everything. Because in those places, first of all, there's no way for those communities to pay for those services. It's extremely expensive if you follow the current procedures to deploy the standards that those companies are used for in those places. That would make the network unviable. So you have to train them to build the network under their own terms, but at the same time, you have to train them to make it secure, and they have to know what they are doing. They have to know what they have configured. They have to know the risks. So the second very important part is capacity building. So you have to make sure that it's a strong community, that it's trained, that it knows what they are doing, that they know what they are configuring and installing. And of course, there's always a need for funds. But if you compare the effort that is required to deploy standard internet coverage by companies in those places compared to what could cost to train the people and provide the equipment, there are orders of magnitude of difference. So those are the barriers I was referring to. We have to look for those partners that are aligned with this and willing to help. And we are a very strong supporter of community infrastructure and community networks. And it's there are many angles with it, because oftentimes those communities can access public infrastructure that companies might not be able to access, may not be allowed, but as they own their own facilities and ducts and things, they can use them themselves or the lands, or whenever they want to deploy a tower, they own the land because they are locals. That there are many things that make things much more easier for them compared to companies. So that's business models that it's proven to be sustainable, and we look forward to identify more partners and people and communities willing to work with us on that.
Thank you very much, Christian. And well, we are actually reaching to the end of the session. We only have 5 more minutes for your final remarks, and we will try to make them. I know it's difficult to concentrate all the things that you may like to say, but first, before to go to that final round of interventions, I will ask Karim, please, if you could read some of the questions, and perhaps one of our panelists will like to answer some of them. You can go, please, Karim.
Thank you, Roberto. Of course, we had a lot of questions, and most of them were solved in the chat conversation. But we have Mokhtar Yedali, who would like to respond to one question. The first one: are there good examples of government policies and multilateral aid projects that specifically support community network in remote areas, which could help define solutions for other national situations? The second one, a dollar can't be spent twice. If spent on spectrum, cannot be spent on network deployment. What would be the impact if spectrum spending would be devoted to network deployment? And the third one, access and cost are the major challenge facing rural communities in developing countries. Like, for instance, in Sierra Leone, internet is still very expensive, and access at the rural level is another case. What is the role of ITU to support these communities? Mokhtar can respond to the first one, and we can see other panelists for the two others. Mokhtar?
Yes, thank you very much. And just in case of the gentleman confused me with ITU. I don't work for ITU. I work for African Union Commission. In case of, just all right. Now, the African Union member state have met in a ministerial conference during a military conference last year, 2019, and have really supported, decided to support the community network within the continent. And my team and I, we have been tasked really to start working on that. And we are very much cooperating with some institutions like Internet Society to see how we can come up with a policy. And we start already promoting the use of the community network. Now, we don't want it to be really controversial with that. We don't want it to be in confrontation with the local operators. We are preserving, we're making sure that we are preserving, while preserving the interests of those licensed operators. We are trying to fill the gap with those policy, and this policy is actually being prepared from the African Union point of view. Over to you, and I really support the fact that spectrum is not money. Spectrum is something for the development. It's not really something to just pay debts with or to enjoy the money of. We have to use it for something. Spectrum versus development. This is probably the best approach for a policy. Over to you.
Thank you, Mokhtar. And before going to the last remarks of our panelists, I would also like to read. There was one question that I'm not sure it was answered, but I think it's good. If a government asks you sincerely, what are the 3 things we should do in order to facilitate meaningful access to most of our people? What should be your answer? Well, now we can go. Anyone will start? Maybe Sylvia would like to start?
It's been, I think part of the answer is that it depends. It depends on where you are, what the local conditions are, what the current availability is. I mean, there's a variety of, I would say, different parameters that need to be taken into account. What the government should be doing is figuring out how to facilitate investment in infrastructure, whether that's by direct subsidy, by providing facilities that can be resold, for example, wholesale and retail, or adopting policies that encourage investment and competition. There are just a variety of things that government can do in order to provide incentive for investment in infrastructure and operation of new facilities.
Thank you, Bent. We can go with Sylvia.
Thank you, Roberto. I think that we'll go back to the main point that I made before, that is investing in people. If governments forget that this is all about the people that they are serving, the people that that elected them, that put them to office to actually deliver, then it becomes a numbers game, and it's easy to forget that you're actually talking about people. So, you know, if you are investing in capacity building, if you are investing in access to devices, in sorting out public access, like in the example that Igor mentioned on the chat, or any other option or solution that is available that you find out that is culturally appropriate and fit for purpose, then always remember that it's about people, and that should guide our decisions and how we take action. So that's why I mentioned earlier on the chat also that it is hard to guide our decisions and our actions based on effective and real principles on human rights. And, you know, and I encourage you to find those principles, to look at the organizations that are actually articulate them, the principles for digital development, the principles for effective innovation, the principles for intermediate liability. There are a bunch of those out there that people in different parts of the equation could look at those. If you stick to those, we will get there. The problem is we tend to forget that it's about people, and then we take actions that are actually hurting people. So just don't forget that, and we will get there eventually. It took us 25 years to get half of the world connected. It might take us another 25. So we'll see how it goes.
Thank you, Sylvia. Now we go with Christian, please.
Yes, and I'll try to not to repeat myself, but to provide some examples on how to identify those barriers and the incentives that are required. So oftentimes, when you go to a regulator asking for permissions to use certain equipment or to use certain part of the spectrum, or to get rights to cross or use a bridge or things like that, you get a negative response without explanation. And oftentimes that the reason for that is that there's a process, or there is something that it's not allowed, but it's not clear why. And the way to address those gray areas or those blocking or barriers, it's to create an open space for discussion. So whenever it's a proposal to do something that can help connect people, let's try to invite as many people as possible to the discussion, analyze all the problems. There might be things that when we ask for those permissions, there might be reasonable answers, and we can address different ways to do that. But the way to identify and address those barriers are to transparently and openly discuss those decisions. And this is what we often call a multi-stakeholder discussion, but it's really the culture of transparently work together in a cooperative and collaborative way.
Thank you very much, Christian. We go with Monji now. Your final remarks, Monji. Thank you.
Thank you. First, I agree with Mukhtar regarding spectrum. In fact, we need better regulation, better spectrum policy, and even adapted spectrum policy for rural remote area. We need to allow network spectrum sharing. So if we allow spectrum sharing, we allow network sharing, radio site sharing, and also sharing of power sharing, mainly in many countries where we have problem with power. You know, in electricity, and I were also the Minister of Energy, in electricity in many countries now, we build off-grid solution, mini-grid solution, micro-grid solution, and a solar kit. And we have solar to provide power, and with a cost reducing cost decreasing each year. We have to provide by sharing also radio solution adapted to rural and remote area in order to improve coverage for this area. But as I said in the beginning and in the second speech, that for me the main is usage, to increase the usage, the benefit of a population by having internet, to improve skills and to master the usage of internet and the application. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Monchi. And finishing the closing remarks with Sonia, please. You have the floor.
Thank you, Roberto. I thought there were one more after me, but I have to say, after what everybody said, which of course was spot on, there's not much left. But I will then mention something that I put on the chat that we didn't have a chance to look at. And that is that we really have to think more seriously about all of these issues and bring a very strong, not just gender perspective to the concerns, but also a perspective of rural communities. I think that really begs for the need for very clear targets and clear goals by governments, clear universal access goals and objectives, and they need to be in such a way that we can measure, we can keep all of us accountable and policymakers accountable when they have those universal access goals. So I would urge all policymakers to have very clear goals, targets that are not just about aggregates of the country, but targets that are specific for the entire population, for the women and girl population, so gender targets, and also very clear targets to address the needs of rural communities. Those two groups, and there's many other marginalized communities, but those two are by far the most not only marginalized, but frankly, increasingly excluded from the digital opportunity. So in addition to everything that everybody said, I would say we need to be a lot more intentional as to how we think about our role, our responsibility for development of the sector everywhere in the world. And we also need to make sure that that intentionality is one that focuses on the abilities of women in rural communities to have access to meaningful connectivity. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sonia. Well, actually, we would love to be here at least for an hour more, but actually we passed a little bit of our time. So I will really love to thank you, all the panelists, Bent, Christian, Sonia, Morgi, Sylvia, Mokhtar, for these great interventions during the session. We received a lot of your wisdom. We know that most of your recommendations will be taken into account in all this dialogue that has been established for a couple of years now, and I think give us a very nice future. We still need to maintain the dialogue between all the different stakeholders, and hopefully to think about new and creative ways to overcome the situation about internet affordability, and finally really get this global and universal access that we all want, but of course meaningful. I would also like to thank Karim Ardomani, my colleague and friend, and all the IGF Secretariat for all the support in these great sessions. I think there are going to be other spaces in which we will get together again to continue the discussion. Thank you very much, and thank you, of course, to all the people that were following this fantastic session. Thank you very much, and we'll see you later.
See you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mokhtar.
Karim, tu as tout fait pour m'amener ici, hein? N'est-ce pas?
Merci pour ta présence.
Bon, allez, porte-toi bien.
Merci, au revoir.
Roberto, gracias.
Gracias, Mokhtar. Thank you.
Buenas noches.
We didn't get to meet you before, but now we already do, and I'm sure we're going to change a lot in the near future.
Indeed, wonderful. Great to see you.
Have a great day.
Bye.
Good night.
Hasta la vista.
Hasta la vista. Bye bye. Okay, Karim. Thank you. Bye bye.